Evan, because you're in the U.S., I'm going to start with you. That poll in and of itself, like 1 percentage point divides them. It's basically like that in each of the swing states, save for a non-swing state poll that came out in Iowa that has a lot of sort of eyeballs raising or eyebrows raising today. Is it your sense after being here in the States for all these months that it is this close?
Oh, it's a toss-up. There's 7 swing states, and each state is really, really tight. And it's going to come down to 3 things. One, the get out the vote. And that really does favor Kamala Harris. She's got more money, and her get out the vote strategy and team is better than Donald Trump's. But if Kamala Harris wins, it'll be because suburban women came out and her get out the vote was better. If Donald Trump wins, it's because the issues that he's focused on, the salient issues, the economy and the border, and distrust of the government were more persuasive than democracy and abortion, which she has more focused on. But you're right. It's going to come down to the get out the vote machine and then little pockets of populations, Vassy. You know, Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania, how are they going to vote? Arab Americans in Michigan. Pockets of populations in swing states are going to be remarkably consequential in a coin toss election.
The polling in the U.S., Dan, is, as we were just discussing, so close. In Canada, when you poll Canadians on what outcome they would like to see, it's not close, right? The overwhelming majority are in favor of Vice President Kamala Harris winning the vote tomorrow. Why do you think it is as close as it is in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, it's not a new phenomenon for presidential elections to be in a very narrow margin, right? I mean, they have for some time come down to a very small number of communities in a very small number of states. And whether or not those voters choose to show up on election day, Evan's absolutely right. I mean, this truly will come down to whether or not a few thousand people across a few states in northeastern United States actually show up and vote. Most of those people are women, and a lot of them decided not to show up in 2016 to vote in favor of Hillary Clinton. Kamala Harris's campaign seems pretty confident. A lot of them are going to show up tomorrow. And frankly, I think the polls being this tight is really helpful in this final stretch to the Kamala Harris campaign. They need people to have a sense of urgency, a sense of the stakes, a sense of the commitment that's required in a lot of places to line up for hours and go through the process of voting. That's tough. And when people think very confidently going into election day that their preferred candidate, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, are well ahead in the polls, as they predicted back in both of those elections, they don't show up and vote. And I think the reality is that most people don't have that assurance going into tomorrow. As you say, as we're talking about here, it feels like a toss-up. And so a lot of people are going to make the choice to get out and vote. And I think that's actually going to be very helpful to Kamala Harris's campaign.
Shakir, Dan's point is completely bang on, that it has come down to a handful of key swing states and the voters in those states now on a number of occasions. But on this occasion, the one side is framing the other as a complete threat, existential threat to the end of democracy in the United States. And yet still, they are as close as they are, at least in national polling. Why do you think that is?
I think if you're supporting Donald Trump, all these kind of these fear-mongering tactics, I think it's already baked into the calculation when you're voting for him, right? And I think what you're seeing, I know Evan and Dan just touched on the getting out the vote, but if you look at some of these polling numbers, men are breaking pretty heavily for Donald Trump and women are breaking pretty heavily for Kamala Harris. I think the issue here is if men stay home, obviously Trump loses, but I think for Harris, she needs to have a significant win with women, because I think if you look at some of these breakdowns, the groups that traditionally support Democrats in elections are not solely behind Harris. Like you look at black men, for example, black men have not really caught fire with the Harris campaign, and I think Obama's scolding of men to vote for her hasn't helped that cause. Latino voters, right? Latino voters, despite Trump's rhetoric around immigration, I think the Latinos that are in America legally actually resonate with Trump's position. You look at Arab Americans, like Evan Sullivan brought up. I mean, Democrats' policies towards Israel are going to cause a lot of Arab Americans to either stay home or not vote. And we saw that in the primary with Joe Biden as well. And I think when you look at some of these working class voters as well, they're just really upset over the issue around inflation. They're upset around how their paycheck has been eroded. And so I think for Kamala Harris to come out victorious, despite how close the polls show her and Trump, she needs to really offset these groups that are not going to be there for her on E-Day, that have traditionally been Democratic kind of strongholds or strong demographics.
Kathleen, you've been on the ground on a number of elections. I keep wondering, is there something that the polls can't capture? Like, I understand that you're asking people, how would you vote if that election were held right now? But is there stuff that can transpire on the ground to motivate people to vote one way or the other that is difficult to capture sort of on a data-based scientific way as the pollsters do?
For sure. And I think one of the reasons they're pointing to the tight polls right now is also that some of the methodological challenges that happened in 2016 in terms of actually trying to find those Trump voters that the polls didn't reveal in 2016. The pollsters have worked really hard at trying to correct that. So I think we are seeing a greater number of Trump supporters, and that's why it's been so tight. But also there could be a whole swath of Trump voters that are still not captured. People unwilling to admit that they're voting for Trump or like his policies. To your question about what else could make a difference, GOTV. That's what politicos like myself focus on in the last few days of an election campaign. That is get out the vote. And right now it's actually the Kamala Harris campaign that has a massive machine funded by the money that she's been able to raise, and supporters that are out there knocking on doors and pulling that vote. Basically, the Republicans have subcontracted their entire get out the vote campaign, then door knocking, to Elon Musk, who's out there literally paying canvassers to go, push them into U-Hauls and drive them around. And when you're paid to do that work, you're inclined to maybe not always be that truthful how many doors you actually knocked and how many supporters you actually recruited or convinced to get out and vote on E-Day. You actually want canvassers who are doing that door knocking to buy into the spirit of it, not just waiting for an Elon Musk paycheck or some kind of lottery win. So I actually think that's where the weakness of the Republican campaign actually has been, on that really machinery of the vote that is so important and that politicos, like many of us on this panel, focus on when it comes down to elections.
I think, Laura, also the elephant in the room is not even really what happens tomorrow, but what happens after that, and the groundwork that the Trump campaign and the candidate himself have already done to lay out a case to reject the results if they don't go their way. How do you anticipate that plays out?
Honestly, that's what I'm most anxious about, and I think a lot of people watching tomorrow's results will be most anxious about, because I don't think we're going to know the full extent of the results tomorrow night. And I think, kind of what we saw on January 6th with Trump supporters storming Congress, the White House, kind of the violent rhetoric that we've been seeing this campaign. It's very anxiety inducing. And I think people on both sides are very nervous about how this plays out. We have seen former President Trump sowing distrust in results leading up to this. We know that the country is pretty much divided, and it's very polarized. Dan mentioned, races are always close in the U.S., right? But I think there's a specific kind of flavor of polarization that we've seen in the United States over the past couple of years, primarily because we've already lived through a Trump presidency and a Trump loss, and we've seen the results of that. So I think that the story is not going to be over tomorrow night. In fact, I think it's only just beginning, and kind of the reverberations of that, regardless of who wins, are going to be felt for weeks and months to come in the country.
I want to get some Canada into this conversation. I spoke to Trump's ambassador to Canada, Kelly Craft, over the weekend. She had this to say about essentially what a Trump administration would want to see from Canada.
Even the Secretary General complimented President Trump because he was very adamant, even during my time in Canada, that all of the NATO countries pay their 2%. Canada, you can do better. I know you can do better. And Canada needs to look at that. What happens in Ukraine, what happens in Taiwan will affect us all. And that's why Donald Trump is insisting that countries that are not yet at the 2%, they need to step up. 2032 is that's not good enough.
Evan, I just got a few minutes left. I want to get everybody in. What should Canada be watching for in the coming weeks?
Well, look, the 2% is an aspirational goal. Donald Trump probably was ahead of the curve in terms of getting NATO countries to contribute more to a goal, by the way, that Paul Martin set. Canada's not going to do it right away. And let's just be clear. The issue for Donald Trump and NATO and supporting his allies is not just the 2%, is that he is not a multilateralist. He's an isolationist. Whether you pay 2% or not, NATO's in trouble, and his support for Ukraine is not contingent on Canada's contribution. If Donald Trump's elected, Russia will be delighted because support for Ukraine will go down. But the real issue for Canada under a Donald Trump administration will be the renegotiation of the new NAFTA, the UNMCA, and the USMCA. Every single CEO across Canada right now has a playbook called Trump 2.0. What's going to happen with tariffs? Will he punish Canada? That is the singularly most impactful thing for the Canadian economy. Tariffs, tariffs, tariffs.
Dan, how worried are the feds right now about the prospect of another Trump presidency?
I mean, they've had one before, right? So I think there is a almost Groundhog Day like feeling right now in terms of going through this election, and a concern about what it means either way. I mean, we've seen a lot of signals from the federal Liberals since earlier this year, I think as far back as January, when they started talking about preparing for this outcome and preparing for a situation in which they had to go back into a long-term negotiation with a Trump presidency about the USMCA and our free trade covenants. I think what becomes concerning in this is whether or not the Trump administration is successful in driving a wedge between Canada and Mexico in those negotiations. Last time, I think a lot of the interests of those two countries were aligned. And if I look at the clip you played earlier in your previous segment, Trump's really tying the immigration, the politics of immigration, the politics of migration into this trade conversation now. And the relationship between U.S. and Mexico will be very different. And so I think where we need to be concerned about is, do we have partners in this conversation, and how do we tailor our arguments to be the most compelling in that negotiation? We haven't, I think, frankly, no matter who wins the presidency, I think we as a country need to do better at figuring out what America wants to buy from us and making it for them. And so I think we need to do a lot more work tailoring our trade relationship to success with America, frankly, not just in negotiations, but in outcomes.
I'm just coming up against the commercial break. I want to get 30 seconds to Shakir and 30 seconds to Kathleen. Shakir, what do you think is going to be big for Canada?
Just quickly, I mean, we're making Trump into this boogeyman, but I think no matter who wins, they both have committed to renegotiating NAFTA. They both want us to reach 2%. So I think if you're in Canada, it's less about who wins over there. It's more about when we get into our next election, who do you think is better to negotiate with whatever American president is in place? And I think if you look at some of the polling right now, it does seem like Pierre Poilievre is in a better position to be the guy to negotiate with America when they reopen NAFTA.
Kathleen, last word to you.
I think that the biggest thing is just the fact of whoever wins government in the next federal Canadian election, this issue of renegotiating NAFTA, CUSMA, is going to have to clear the decks, and it'll be the #1 priority. So whoever's doing transition planning in the Privy Council really will be focused on how they can implement this and move around other policy agendas, because this will dominate. Remember, when we were negotiated NAFTA the last time, it basically took up 3 years, right, of the government agenda. It was full-on charm offensive all the time.
Yeah, who could forget? I feel like we might be in for it again. I got to leave it there. Thanks, everybody. Laura Stone, Evan Solomon, Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, and Kathleen Monk, our front bench. We're back in a moment with Nick Nanos.